Welcome to Chicago, where we eat pizza with a fork and knife, refuse to put ketchup on our hot dogs for some reason, and we have the worst recycling rate of any major metropolitan area in the country. In 2020 alone, we generated 4.13 million tons of trash from private homes, commercial properties, and construction projects. On average, according to a report done by the University of Illinois at Chicago, Chicagoans generate more waste at home than residents in peer cities or regions like New York and California. It's estimated that Chicago residents generate over 3 pounds of waste per day and under 3,000 pounds of waste per year per household. And of all that shit, only 8.78% of our waste ends up getting recycled. That's pretty well and below what you'd think the city would be targeting, but in fact, Chicago's recycling rate has actually only gone down the past couple years. But why is it so embarrassingly low? And why is it shockingly just getting worse? And what can we do to fix it?
Chicago, for the size of a city it is, has underdeveloped recycling and reuse infrastructure. Also just a real lack of kind of awareness and participation in those things. But the origins of that are more complicated than, like Portland does it right and Chicago does it wrong. There's an extremely long legacy of corruption and mismanagement which brought us to this point, so.
Recycling in Chicago hasn't always been as messed up as it is now, because actually it was even worse. The garbage way we've been handling our garbage goes back to the very start of the recycling program in the city. Chicago's recycling program actually started back in the early 90s when Richard Let Me Eat My Reuben in Peace Daley was mayor, but as a blue bag program. The idea was to separate your recycling into blue trash bags and then throw them out with the rest of your garbage. Those blue bags would then get picked up along with the rest of the trash in the same truck and then head off to waste stations where workers would sort out the blue bags to be recycled. The blue bag program was apparently a horrible failure. It was notoriously unpopular with Chicagoans, and the blue bags would often rip and spill out the recyclable materials on the way to the waste facility. The city also apparently kind of lied about the success of the program, claiming the engagement rate involved around 1/3 of the city, but when a report went public in 2003, it was revealed that only 13% of households participated in the program. In 2007, the city swapped the bags for the blue bins in only a couple of neighborhoods at first. And in 2013, finally, the entire city switched over to the blue bins we have today. And guess what happened then? Our recycling performance actually got worse. And it's not really that surprising, to be honest. The thing is, the system we have now is not very good also. Single stream recycling, as in sorting all of your recyclables into one single bin that gets picked up all together, is said to possibly contaminate up to 1/3 of the materials intended to be recycled. Why does Chicago still have such an abysmal recycling system now, though? Why does our recycling rate resemble the Rotten Tomatoes score for an Adam Sandler movie? Is our recycling program just so much worse than other cities? Do Chicagoans just not care about recycling? Recently, Chicago contracted with the Delta Institute to write up a report on how we can improve our waste and recycling program. So let's ask the Delta Institute CEO, Bill Scheisler, why he thinks Chicago's recycling rate is so low right now.
We don't see these materials as valuable, so we just think of them going away in some sort of abstract sense. And it's just something that really isn't top of mind or a priority for a lot of people. So just because of that, there's a lack of political will. There's just a lack of motivation to do anything with it because we're not space constrained. That we don't have to think creatively or come up with innovative solutions for what we have right now.
In 2017 and 2018, Waste Management, which handles the pickup of about half the city's recycling, or at least used to, but we'll get into that in a minute, accounts for around 90% of the citizens' recyclables that were deemed contaminated or recyclables that were deemed not recyclable and sent to a landfill instead. Coincidentally, Waste Management is reportedly the only recycle hauler in the city that runs a for-profit dump. Even more coincidentally, Waste Management gets paid by the city twice for doing this. Once for picking up the recycling and once for transporting the contaminated recycling to a landfill instead of recycling it. Waste Management has, of course, denied that they're tagging recycling as contaminated intentionally to make more money, and maybe it is just a coincidence, but it is quite a coincidence for sure. They say their higher contamination tagging is due to the potential damage contaminated recycling can do to their recycling equipment, and also their concerted efforts to better educate Chicagoans on what's recyclable. How nice of them. Some residents that have had their recycling tagged as contaminated contested, though. There have been numerous reports of Chicagoans that have had their recycling bins tagged, but insist that they are thorough about making sure the recycling is all good. It's definitely true, though, that contamination is an issue currently. A 2017 study by the Recycling Partnership found that almost 25% of shit placed in blue bins was contaminated and unrecyclable. Recycling contamination can mean a few different things also. It can be things that contaminate other recyclable materials, like a greasy pizza box or food container that wasn't emptied and cleaned properly, or just items that are difficult to separate and recycle at a processing facility, like, say, plastic grocery bags or shredded paper. When the recyclable materials become contaminated, it can lower the quality of the end recycled product and make it harder to sell off. This is becoming especially challenging since the cost of recycling processing is going up. There were also environmental and health concerns related to the ways we deal with trash here too. Communities on the south and west sides of the city are disproportionately harmed by the environmental impact and location of waste management infrastructure, which then has a negative impact on air quality and public health. Fly dumping, which is the illegal dumping of waste outside of an authorized method, tends to be more likely to be hazardous. It also tends to be more of a problem on the south and west sides, also according to official records of fly dumping complaints in the city. Currently, there are no landfills in Chicago or even Cook County, and we are currently transporting our trash to a few landfill sites in other areas of Illinois and Indiana. Improving our recycling and waste system is critical to improving the quality of life of the people who are hurt by the negative effects of our current system the most. COVID-19 has had some significant effects on our waste system too. Lakeshore Recycling Services estimates there's been a 20 to 30% increase in residential waste in Chicagoland service areas because of the pandemic. Because of restaurants' increased reliance on delivery and takeout during the pandemic, there's also been an increase in usage and waste of single-use polystyrene and plastic packaging and silverware. And also, unfortunately, because of COVID-19, the recent plastic-free water ordinance proposed in January of 2020 was put on hold to keep from putting a greater burden on restaurants. Hospitals, too, have become more reliant on single-use PPE to help lower the spread of COVID. For instance, George Washington University Hospital estimates it's generating 2 to 3 times more medical waste since the beginning of the pandemic. On top of all this, COVID has slowed down or altogether stopped many of the potential plans the city could have started implementing back in 2020. As I mentioned earlier, Chicago produced roughly 4.13 million tons of trash in 2020, and the total amount of waste generated has slowly been increasing over the last decade. There can be some problems when it comes to interpreting this type of data, though. For one, it's tricky interpreting data collected for a year when we were experiencing a global pandemic. Certain trends might be different, many industries weren't really operating at full capacity, and people were definitely spending a lot more time at home. Also, just in general, it can be tricky and very difficult to measure waste diversion and recycling rates by volume.
So there's lots of different streams of materials of how much waste we generate as a city, and then that gets parsed out per person, and it also gets parsed out by stream and by type. The number that gets tossed around a lot is the city's number for single-family residential recycling. So it doesn't take into account a lot of the recycling that happens in institutions, commercial buildings, or industrial facilities. It doesn't take into account the large amount of recycling that happens from construction and demolition debris materials, like the building materials, asphalt and bricks and concrete getting reused, and that sort of thing. So our real recycling rate or diversion rate is higher than the 9% recycling rate that we see there. And when you're looking at comparisons between cities, a lot of cities report these numbers in different ways. So I think San Francisco uses a diversion rate, which is different than the recycling rate that we look here. So we always want to make sure that we're comparing the same numbers and the same type and the same ways that people are looking at these materials. But it is important, we want to be real about this and be like, we can do much more in this city, but also, let's be sure that we know what we're calculating and we're comparing against and why.
So, the city provides recycling services for low-density buildings, meaning buildings with 4 or fewer residential units. This covers around 620,000 residential units, which is around half the units in the city. And for these low-density households, the waste fee, which is just the cost of waste and recycling per unit, works out to around $9.50. This is actually a bit lower than other places generally. For instance, LA's waste fee is around $36, and St. Louis's is around $14.
The cost of waste for an average citizen in Chicago is really low. So because of that, that's one of those drivers that you don't really see, and it's just set up that way.
Basically, this means Chicago spends around the equivalent of a Big Mac meal per household every month for waste collection. The 2020 budget for DSS allocated around $44 million for disposal of around 850,000 tons of residential garbage. This number only covers disposal costs, by the way. It doesn't cover the cost of labor, and the garbage collection fee doesn't cover the cost of DSS collected trash.
So I've mostly lived in 3-unit buildings in my time in Chicago, and I think I've had recycling in my building for a total of about a year and a half out of 10 years. We just got recycling in the building that I've lived in for 5 years.
Now, that's just half the city, though. Let's talk about high-density buildings, meaning buildings with 5 or more units, or industrial, commercial, or institutional waste generators, including things like offices, restaurants, or even government facilities. The fees for pickup for these buildings are usually a little bit higher here, working out to somewhere between $10 and $16 per unit per month. There's a big problem with the way Chicago has been monitoring recycling pickup in these high-density buildings, however. And that is that we maybe don't even know if they're recycling properly at all. According to a recycling enforcement audit by the Inspector General of the city, the Department of Streets and Sanitation doesn't thoroughly enforce some of its own rules on commercial and high-density residential buildings. If you live in one of these high-density buildings, the Chicago Recycling Ordinance states that owners or occupants are supposed to contract with a private hauler or cause a contract to be entered into with a private hauler for the provision of source-separated recycling services. Basically, this means that if you live in a building or own a business, the city doesn't actually provide you with recycling services. You need to seek out a private hauler and then pay for it. Also, if one of these buildings violates that requirement, the city of Chicago is supposed to give them 30 days to comply. And if the building doesn't meet the requirements in those 30 days, they can be fined between $500 and $5,000 per day. This ordinance also requires private recycling haulers to fill out an annual report detailing the source, type, and amount of recyclables collected. These reports are supposed to assist the DSS in determining waste diversion rates and monitoring goals for waste removal. So great, it sounds like the city, while not entirely controlling and funding recycling pickup, at least has some fail-safes to make sure everything is going well, except wait. No, they actually don't. The Inspector General audit found that the DSS doesn't thoroughly enforce the Chicago Recycling Ordinance, which is supposed to make sure that commercial and high-density residential buildings are actually recycling. The audit found that even the department's mobile e-ticket citation system doesn't even allow users to issue citations for violations, and of course this affects a huge part of the city. According to the Census Bureau's 2018 American Community Survey, around 500,000 Chicago households, which is about 41% of the city, are in buildings with 5 or more units. And then don't forget about businesses. There's around 60,000 licensed businesses in Chicago that are supposed to be providing private waste and recycling services. The fact that the DSS isn't really enforcing the ordinance means that these households and businesses might not actually be recycling. This audit also found that DSS doesn't make sure private haulers are submitting accurate reports on who they serve and how much recycling they actually haul. In 2018, of the 15 licensed private waste haulers that were supposed to submit reports, the DSS only received 9, 3 of which were submitted after the deadline, then only got 4 more of them after sending out a request 8 months later, and then just never got the last 2. And out of the 13, 5 of them weren't even fully completed, completely throwing off any sort of accurate data collection to calculate the city's waste diversion rate. Without the reports, the city has an even tougher time making sure the recycling program is working and how best to work on fixing it.
If you are in the city of Chicago and you are in a multi-unit residence, then you are under different rules than if you're in a single-family residence, which is 4 or fewer units. And then how that data is collected and reported is different. And that goes for the same for like a commercial building. That goes the same for like a school or a sports arena. So how do we get all of those numbers for things that are being done to abide by the ordinance that the city has, but then we have them in one place and can really figure out where we should be investing our money to have the biggest bang for our buck.
So what is the city doing now? Now that the Delta Institute report is released, what is the city planning on doing to fix the system? Chicago does have a general guide on what you can and can't recycle. It mentions that you can recycle plastic containers like milk jugs and water bottles, and does have a section for items that the city does not recycle, including things like chip bags, styrofoam, and maybe kind of ironically biodegradable utensils. There's even a quiz you could take to test or teach yourself about the city's recycling system, although it's far from comprehensive. It only takes about 2 minutes. Now, I didn't even know about this resource until I started researching for this video, and I'm guessing a lot of other Chicagoans don't either. In 2019, Chicago diverted 1,100 tons of yard waste, although there have been many reports by residents frustrated by the way the current system operates. In 2014, CPS partnered with 7 Generations Ahead and LRS to initiate a commercial composting pilot program. It's currently in 14 Chicago public schools and resulted in a diversion of 2,500 pounds of materials every day before COVID-19 last year. Unfortunately, the city doesn't have a regular pickup service for yard waste anymore due to capacity issues, and now it only has the request model. There's also a 311 service for special items like mattresses, as well as several city-run and private-owned places you can go to recycle electronics and other hazardous or difficult to recycle stuff. It can be kind of hard to recycle responsibly this way, though. Chicago's a big city, and not everyone has the time and means to go to all these different drop-off sites to properly dispose of things.
We get a lot of questions at the tool library from people wondering how they can recycle their items, especially tricky items like power tools, for example. They have a lot of parts that are plastic, a lot of parts that are metal, and they really just don't know what to do with them, and there aren't a lot of resources out there to help them. A lot of people don't want to go to the Goose Island location to be able to recycle tricky things. If there were more locations where people live, I think people would build better habits around recycling because it would be easier for them. You can't expect people to go all the way across the city to do something, to do the right thing.
Chicago actually has what they call a site waste ordinance for construction contractors, which it established in 2007, that obligates them to track the debris they create during projects and to recycle at least 50% of it. This seems like some of the more aggressive legislation regarding recycling, and it seems to be kind of effective at least. When including construction and demolition into our overall recycling rate, it increases from its measly 9% all the way up to 45%. Chicago's recent hybrid ban, which charged a tax on every disposable grocery bag a person used, reportedly cut plastic bag use by 30%, although I'd be curious personally if that stat has remained since the implementation of it a few years ago. So maybe let's talk about a few other places that are already doing more than we are here in Chicago, because there are a lot of them all over the world. Even in just the US, there are a ton of cities that are outclassing Chicago currently. San Francisco, for instance, reports that it manages to divert up to 80% of its waste from landfills. The city requires residents and companies to separate waste into 3 different streams: blue for recyclables, green for compostable materials, and black for materials that are sent to landfills. Taiwan has 13 different recycling bills that residents sort through themselves when the recycling trucks come around for pickup.
I recently visited the city of Boulder in Colorado. I think that's another one. They actually have in certain public areas public composting. So just like you have, say, a single receptacle where there's an opening for trash, there's an opening for recycling, they also have an opening for compost.
Other countries like Germany and South Korea also have multi-bin systems and reportedly divert more than 50% of their trash from recycling as well. In UIC's report on Chicago's waste disposal strategies, they found that implementing source separation by 75% of organic waste from single-family homes would boost landfill diversion rates by 18.6%. That's something that we could just be doing now. I don't see any reason why Chicago couldn't implement a multi-bin system at the very least.
Looking at what those cities have done, because their waste diversion rates outside of landfills, so really their recycling rate functioning like what we're talking about, can range from 60 to 80%. And that's tremendous and something that should be that North Star, because when we're sitting at 8 or 9%, and we've been there for a number of years, despite the growing support for taking environmental sustainability protection more seriously, shows us that we've got a ways to go, but that we can take even some intermediary steps that will help us double, triple that rate.
Composting is certainly a good option as well, although if you don't really have a personal use for composting, like me, or can't feasibly bring your composting to a drop-off point, you actually have to pay between $10 and $40 a month for composting pickups, which can be a pretty big detriment for a lot of people.
Other things that we should consider, and I think that we could do relatively quickly, concern composting. One would be setting up regional sites where folks can come and drop off yard waste, food waste, to start getting folks more comfortable with what is compostable, what isn't. We could also ensure that more of our schools have on-site or off-site composting so that we ingrain better habits, both in students as well as the families that they'll go home to and say, hey, here's what I learned in class today.
The Sierra Club reportedly says that Bottle Bills, which is an initiative that charges a refundable deposit on all single-use beverage bottles, plastic, metal, or glass, are the single most effective means for boosting recycling. As of now, only 10 states currently employ bottle bills. There are certainly cheaper and arguably more convenient ways to lower the amount of shit you use too. For instance, here in Chicago, we have the Chicago Tool Library.
So the Chicago Tool Library works a lot like a public library in the sense that it's a space where people can borrow things, but instead of books, we lend people all kinds of tools that they can use to repair their homes or participate in projects, garden, whatever they need to do. We want it to be as accessible as possible for people. We want it to have as few barriers to use as possible, so we try and model ourselves like the public library as much as we can.
The Tool Library is an awesome resource for people, especially considering that their membership system is a pay-what-you-want scheme.
Folks sign up, give us a little bit of contact information about themselves, and then they're able to borrow things. We do have a small kind of suggested membership fee for folks to participate, but it is on a completely open sliding scale, which means people are allowed to pay what makes sense for them in their budget to participate.
It's also not just a good way to have access to tools you may not have, but it's also a great idea to give use for tools that maybe weren't getting used before. It's also just a great way to get people interested and comfortable with the idea of a more sustainable lifestyle, since it encourages the sharing of materials, like a library. It'd be great for the city to either fund more places like the Tool Library or maybe just work on them themselves. One of the reasons there aren't more resources like this in the city is because they can be hard to set up and sustain, especially when you're basically competing against the mindset that we have as consumers.
Share, repair, reuse are all things that the city should be looking at and promoting. And there's a lot of other nonprofits and for-profit businesses in the city that can be partners and collaborators to figure out how to get those materials out of the waste stream or keep them out of the waste stream before they even, can be close to getting there.
Another great place similar to the Chicago Tool Library to go to if you live in Chicago is the Waste Shed.
The Waste Shed is a nonprofit that operates a thrift store for art materials and school supplies and creative and educational materials of all kinds. We also do creative and environmental programming, both sort of art education and sort of public art events. When I was living in Portland, I was involved with an organization called Scrap there, which had been around for a long time and was a great resource for the local arts community. When I moved to Chicago, there just wasn't a sort of similar resource, and there was just a huge abundance of materials that were going to waste. So I created the Waste Shed to attempt to kind of close the loop. There was kind of no organization, nothing existing in Chicago that was kind of providing the resource that I thought the community needed, or it wasn't addressing the problems that I saw in a way that seemed, engaging and scalable and sustainable. So I attempted to sort of create something that would address that directly.
There is a really great opportunity for the city to invest in a diverse array of operations and nonprofits and organizations doing work that isn't explicitly recycling, especially like tool libraries, because they're really wonderful, inclusive community spaces that have a ton of other benefits related to education, related to just general care for our neighborhoods, related to self-sufficiency, disaster preparedness, all kinds of things. The more opportunities we can find to kind of accomplish our goals related to waste and recycling while building community at the same time, I think that's definitely something worth investing in. The conversation around recycling needs to be expanded to kind of divert things that aren't necessarily ready to be thrown away and recycled. People need to have a better understanding of where they can take things to be donated and reused. There needs to be more opportunities and more conversations around pre-recycling. Like, what can we be doing before something needs to be recycled? Because there's perfectly usable things that shouldn't go into the waste stream. They should be diverted to a nonprofit or a neighbor or something before they get recycled.
It's really important to point out that none of this even begins to address the biggest problem with recycling in the first place, and that's just the fact that we make so much disposable shit already.
We do not know how to not buy things. People call us a store or a shop. Any sort of change in the, the normal status quo of like, I give you money, you give me thing, and I keep the thing and I throw it away. Like, we just don't have that many examples of alternatives.
Every aspect of our lives is consumed with some sort of fossil fuel reliance and waste production. Every industry is saturated with an overwhelming amount of waste. And that's absolutely the fault of the companies that rely so heavily on plastic and waste producing production in the first place. And for our government for doing nothing to stop it. None of this even begins to address the biggest problem with recycling. The fact that we make so much disposable shit in the first place. Pretty much every aspect of our lives is consumed with some sort of fossil fuel reliance or waste production. Every industry is saturated with an overwhelming amount of waste. One of the big problems with recycling is that in some ways it's kind of a misdirection of what the actual problem is. Corporations that rely and profit on virgin plastics and other waste-producing products have spent decades convincing the public that we could just recycle our way to a greener, better future. That the problem wasn't the billions of plastic or aluminum bottles and cans, or the tons and tons of waste we produce every year, but simply the fact that we just weren't recycling any of it.
Join PepsiCo in the recycling of every last bottle and can.
We need to radically reduce the amount of waste we're producing, along with working towards recycling as much of the waste that we can't keep from creating.
The thing about reuse is like, it's 1-to-1, You take the thing and you reuse it as the thing. It doesn't have to go to a bin to be collected, to go to a processing center to be baled up, to be sold to a processor, to be shipped overseas, to be remanufactured, to be shipped back, to be sold to somebody else. Reuse is just, you take the thing and then you do something else with it.
It makes so much more sustainable sense to just not produce any of this shit, to not have to throw out or recycle so much shit in the first place. It doesn't make sense to tell people that they should be changing their own habits, that we need to be doing more to combat all this shit, when the fact is there are corporations and people that are profiting every day from our convenience-focused and trash-producing lifestyles. Those fuckers need to change more than you or I do. Our wasteful capitalist mindset needs to change. The companies that are fueling us with single-use plastics and packaging are the ones responsible for this global trash epidemic and for the many failures of our recycling program. Chicago's awful recycling rate is simply a symptom of a huge systemic problem that simply isn't being addressed. And no huge systemic change will truly be achieved until we change everything about the way we're currently doing things.